So early discussions that I've had with Paul, it sounds like you have this great community that's been growing in the OHDSI space. And so this is a talk that over this next few hours, I want to introduce folks to some of the basic concepts that may allow you to think about what you're already doing well in slightly different ways, and for some of it to make sense as kind of this engine of innovation and collaboration that you're already a part of and you're already running, but maybe give you some extra insights into how to think about that. And then I also wanted to take you into kind of this space. I'm going to walk you through for the first roughly half, talking about how you think about building healthy projects and how you think about scale and freeloaders. Clearly the fact that you're all here this morning means that you're all active participants. You're all, contributing, you're committing, you're maintaining already. But my bet is you also have a reasonable number of people that don't actually do anything beyond use OHDSI. And I want to make sure that you feel good about that in its simplest terms. And I want to talk about culture and governance along the way as well. I will absolutely take a break at the 90-minute mark because I'll need one. And then some of the things that I want to talk about after that break, I want to talk about how to think about nonprofits. I want to talk a little bit about the engineering economics of how some of this stuff is working for you. And then I want to touch on the idea of projects versus products. And these last three subjects, it's not that I think any of them are critical to what you're doing today and what you might formulate as your next steps. But I think these are things that are going to begin to have an impact on you. And by introducing the discussions early, I'll hopefully give you a framing to be able to have those discussions, kind of in the most successful manner going forward. Any questions so far about where we're going to go today?
Steve, I'm wondering how much of a conversation do you want this to be?
Well, and I was just thinking about that myself. So we've got a large block of time here. I'm thinking that I want to be as flexible as possible. And so as long as the way this screen just changed for me is I can't see the chat window anymore. So as long as somebody else is kind of calling attention, you are welcome to answer questions in the chat. Before we finish up, I'll make sure that I capture it all. So anything that we haven't talked about, I'll get back to folks on in email. The other thing is I'm happy to be interrupted at any point along the way. The only thing I'm asking is that, please be bold and break in. I will in no way be offended. And if somebody is asking questions quietly in the chat, please, Paul, if you stop me and just, call attention to the question.
I am happy to act as a moderator and an instigator.
Thank you. That's that way everybody can feel that they're actually a part of this. And from all the discussions I've had about OHDSI, it really does sound like all of the things you've been doing to date, that you've had really good models. I don't know all of the things you've been reading, but clearly people have been making good choices. And that's, if anything, you're hitting that point where you need to be possibly a little more thoughtful and frame things a little differently now. I've seen this situation a couple of times at Microsoft alone, just in the last 4 years, where a group quietly started doing something and then suddenly had a wild success on their hands, and they weren't tooled up for it. They weren't they didn't have the product dollars to invest. And it's about stepping back and then reframing things. So at no point when I'm going through these first sections, I'm betting a lot of it will sound familiar. Like I said, I'm hoping that the contribution I make is to maybe frame it a little differently for you. So let's talk about healthy projects. One of the things that I like folks to kind of think about just a little bit is, what does success mean? This has always been a space that people have wrestled with easily for the last kind of 22, 23 years since we had an open source definition. And, often the modern equivalent, people talk about, how many GitHub stars are there on the repo kind of thing. And they'll also look at, the number of, clones or fork numbers that a repo has. And they're looking at it from that perspective of somehow that this is a meaningful number from a popularity perspective. And the way we used to talk about it, 20, 22 years ago was, how many downloads does your project have? And that same idea of, how many times has this thing forked? And I don't like those numbers. I never have. Certainly 20 years ago when we used to wrestle with this, like downloads, it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't actually tell you, has the person used the software in any way? Could they even install it, or did they merely download it and then failed? And you just don't have that feedback loop. The thing that I tend to like to look at is, what's your contribution flow? And it's like really that simple. There's lots of different work ongoing right now. The Linux Foundation has the Chaos project, which and there's a beautiful tool set that's all open source from a company called Bitergia that looks at a broad range of numbers. And those numbers can be really useful to help you think about the kind of the shape of your community. But I keep coming back down to the really simple one is, do you have a healthy contribution flow? And when I try and encourage folks to think about it from that perspective, there is that idea that there isn't a single number that contribution flow is going to tell you, are you healthy or not? But are you seeing a steady contribution flow for the size of community that you are? If you're a few dozen folks gathered around a small project with, 2, 3 committers, you can have a very healthy contribution flow as long as there's something showing up on a weekly basis that the code continues to evolve. That said, I can't remember how many hundreds of lines of Linux, the Linux kernel change every day. It's we can talk about scale at both ends of that um, kind of space of project size. But I really care that you're seeing an active project, and to me that means contribution flow. And when I say contribution, I don't mean just code, and we'll talk about that. So I really try and get folks to focus on this idea of on-ramps. And you need these on-ramp, I think about it as on-ramps because it's a way to provide structure to the things that you can be doing. And so, at the heart of every project, there's this idea that there are committers and working code. I'm a big fan of working code. I have seen many industry efforts start with a group of people that want to build something together. And they never get around to it because they're always talking about the structure of what needs to be done. And a lot of the times in this kind of modern period where people are rushing to do open source in new vertical industries, a lot of their historical way of collaborating and cooperating in many different things like trade organizations, that behavior reasserts itself, and they never figure out how to actually, sit down and do code together.
Oh,
And
so
then,
Steve, sorry to interrupt you. I thought it might be worthwhile just to reflect for a few minutes about how we measure success. And so I've been thinking about that as well. As a community, our mission is to create real world evidence that's reproducible. So our ultimate goal has been peer reviewed publications, where people can now do studies on drug effects that are actually statistically sound, and so they're using reproducible methods. So a lot of our goals for success have been looking at peer review. But I thought it might be good for Mark. You might introduce yourself and talk about, and Martijn to introduce yourselves and talk about what have you deemed as success metrics on the contributor side of the source code itself. I don't know, Mark, do you want to start?
I was going to start by punting to Martijn, but I shan't do that. My name is Mark Suchard. I'm a professor of biostatistics at UCLA, one of the founding members of OHDSI and a former what we call research investigators of OMOP. I've been involved with Martijn, who will introduce himself shortly, in developing a large number of the tools upon which the OHDSI tool stack is based. Most of these tools fall within what used to be called the methods library and is now called HADES, which is sort of a formal structure for quality assurance. Before engaging in OMOP and OHDSI, I have been involved in software development for two other large pieces of software, but they're outside of the healthcare domain. They're pieces of research software that are used around the world. And the model that we've used over the last 20 years for that is considerably different than this very open community, open science approach that I have fallen in love with and am an extreme supporter. I'm most interested in growing the community, and one way of growing the community is making sure that we are providing reliable tools that people can use around the world to gather actionable health evidence. My academic background is in computational statistics. So I have a research group, and our research group focuses primarily on sort of performant statistical methods. So I've taken a larger personal inference in the underlying inference machinery for the OHDSI tool stack, but very early on wrote a small amount compared to Martijn of many of the other baseline utilities that most of you are now very familiar with. From a personal perspective, I think good measures of success are not only sort of from the research perspective, having performant tools that people use, but also having an inviting community which new individuals are interested and excited to join into. And if we can promote that type of community, then we will also attract people who are interested in building and continuing on our tool stack. That's kind of relevant, and another personal reason why that's relevant to me is, I'm a little past mid-career. And so I start thinking about, kind of what comes next, who are the next leaders, and how can we help grow those leaders so that, what we've developed continues on, not necessarily in the form or the software that we have. I have no allegiance to any piece of code that I've touched. It could all be deleted, and that's fine, as long as we're still working together in an open science principled approach for actionable healthcare. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Martijn.
All right, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I'm Martijn Schumi. I work at Janssen R&D. I'm the lead of the HADES, development work group, if you call it that. My background is in computer science, I would say, but like Mark, I'm also interested more in, I have a lot of interest in the statistical parts that are underneath all of the software development. For me, the open source software that we develop is sort of a way to make sure that the best practices that we develop with our methods research actually get used. And to both agree and disagree with what Paul said, I do think our end metric of success is the actual clinical research done with our tools, although I'm not sure whether papers is actually the right metric I would use for that. But be that as it may, in terms of looking at the success of our tools, and I'm limiting it now to HADES, which is a set of R packages. We have more software in OHDSI. I think it's already been very successful. If you just look at the number of OHDSI studies that have used one or more of these packages, that's basically all of them. So I think that's a very great success. If you look at the number of contributions, so we certainly have had contributions, but I haven't kept tabs on that, or would be able to comment on whether they've been enough or not enough for the size of the community.
So
With that,
thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah, that was it.
It looks like somebody else wants to comment too, please.
Wouldn't mind mentioning. So I liked what both Mark and Martijn said, but I like I don't know if you've read Tony Hsieh's story of Zappos, but he created a company because these are the people that he wanted to work with. And so I come to OHDSI because I enjoy the kindred spirits who share my values in a collaborative sense. And so for me, the culture of the OHDSI community is really dear to me in having a fun and highly collaborative community.
Absolutely. So I want to thank all three of you because it's the Apache Software Foundation. Their motto has been community over code for a long time now, and they've been around for coming up on 25 years. And it is that idea that it is more than the code at all times. You know, we've all doesn't matter whether your career spans 10 years or 40 like mine, we've all seen massive changes in the technology. What OHDSI is today, it's going to be different in 10 years and then 20 years again. Thank you, Mark, for getting up. If you're at UCLA, thank you for getting up with me. I think the idea that you can that you're thinking about measuring an important metric to the OHDSI community is this idea of papers. I think that's fabulous because it gives you actually that stake in the ground past the projects themselves and to see that actual real world effect. A lot of what we end up, a lot of the debates that I get stuck in, I gave a talk just a couple of weeks ago about this at a Linux Foundation membership summit, is that idea, how do you measure the market effect? And nobody has a good way of doing that yet. The fact that OHDSI is so strong within the research community allows you to start to look at that kind of impact assessment for things like references and papers and such. I think that's a fabulous, step beyond just looking at the health of the project internally at contribution flow, but having a real number that you can point to of things that have been published based on it. I think that's a great story to tell.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's really fun bibliographic research because each paper is a conversation. And so all the papers that cite that paper, you can do a lot of network research around. And so, but I do feel like it's really a way of getting a sense of at least how much conversation is going on in our community in observational research on medical records with and without these reproducible computational methods.
Yes. Well, so is Saeed on the call?
I don't think I saw him.
Okay. We need to make sure Saeed knows you're measuring this. And I say that because one of the challenges that Saeed's wrestling with right now is this idea of an open source programs office. We've had open source program offices in commercial organizations for the last 20 years. And they tend to have a very inward facing view on how, making sure that a large organization with in a commercial setting is they start as license compliance organizations often. So it's like inward facing tooling and processes and typically working with the internal lawyers to make sure that you are either building healthy projects in a legally compliant way with respect to the company, or that they are ingesting open source licensed components into products and services in a kind of a clean manner. But the thing that changes when you step into either a government environment or in this case an academic environment is that those things are still absolutely important. But the open source program office has a new role to play. And one of the things it's instead of trying to measure market impact, it's looking at it exactly like this. How would you measure research impact for projects that have a research bent like this. So, you know, the fact that Johns Hopkins actually has a working relationship right now with Bitergia, this group that does a lot of metrics work around open source projects. This is something that we need to make sure Saeed's well aware of.
Yeah, and for our OHDSI friends, Saeed is actually the director of libraries at Sheridan University, at Johns Hopkins University. So he's a library scientist. And so one of the things I'm hoping that Saeed's going to help us with is when we create phenotypes for our cohort definitions and we publish them as reference as part of our publications, we can get a digital object identifier, DOI, that gives us a unique identifier on the internet, where we could host it someplace where it can be then, whether it's a phenotype library or some FHIR server, where we can actually have these artifacts to be individually identifiable, and so that we can make for more computational applications. And so, yeah, so library science is actually going to can play a really great role in how we disseminate our knowledge artifacts.
Yeah, that's I love working with Saeed. I mean, one of the early meetings we had is when he was describing the challenges that Johns Hopkins was facing with in the open source space. As I said, well, it's great that it's the library that's actually looking at this, because what you have is an information curation problem. So, you know, this fits together really nicely.
Go too far on a tangent. Andrew, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, just a question for the people who've been speaking on how important it is to distinguish OHDSI as a community that's got all these different facets from open source software development communities, given that there are all kinds of metrics about participation and capacity building and so forth that have, you know, that rely on the software, but that are very distinct contributions in and of themselves. Is there any aspect of sort of the framing of this when we're talking? I guess it's coming up because metrics of success that are inherited from a software development community are a partial fit, or they're an excellent fit for the software components of the OHDSI community, but less excellent fit for lots of other kinds of contributions that the community gets. And so I was just wondering if there were a need to kind of highlight those distinctions for the rest of the conversation.
Hey, Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm sorry, Andrew Williams at Tufts. I am involved in many different aspects of OHDSI and have been for a long time. I don't want to enumerate them all.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And Paul, if I may, I'll get signed and take a little bit of prerogative. This is Patrick Ryan. I'm at Jansen in Columbia. Thank you again, Stephen, for doing this for us. I would like, I'll defer to Mark and Martijn on this, but to Andrew's point, I really would like to focus on OHDSI as an open source development community. Just recognizing, Stephen, that you've got a lot of people that are listening to this conversation from across our community, but as I look through that list, many of them may be potential users of software in the community, but many of them are the researchers that are on other facets of the community. But I think for purposes of getting the most out of this conversation, I think focusing on open source development and how we are trying to develop tools that can then enable other parts of our community would be a great focus point.
Perfect. Thank you. And to Andrew's point, I think you guys collectively, you folks have like I said, a great opportunity here because you are successfully building this. You know, I'm hopefully gonna tell you where some of the dragons are in the next stage of your growth. But I think having this opportunity to begin to measure your success from a research perspective beyond the software tooling is a great opportunity to tell that bigger story. Yeah, my challenge is I'm still teaching people about let's do the software well. So, you know, kind of stepping back into that space. You know, all projects start as this idea with, you know, committers and working code, and the idea is to then start driving your user base, because that's that first set of people. Literally, like you lots of folks want it, like, how do I find more developers? Well, you find more developers by finding users. And what's going to happen is those users, some number of them, are going to actually be developers that are using that software. And invariably, they're going to want to make selfish changes to this and they're either fixing a bug they've encountered, or they're adding some critical additional piece of functionality because you've made the software available to them. And then the challenge is, you want to get them to contribute that back in. And we'll talk a little bit later about what the actual economics is that drives that change. But really, if you start to think of it as those three on-ramps, you end up in this space where you end up in a broad space where literally an ecosystem starts to arrive around this project. And this comes back to Andrew's point. What's the ecosystem? Is it the actual project, or is the project merely an anchor in this larger ecosystem of all of these other ways that people are benefiting from the software? And so you're really talking about articulating three on-ramps. And it's how do you encourage that user on-ramp? How do this is where you're going to find those bug reports, those people that are contributing, tutorials and new configurations, and where you're going to find those developers. And then it's, how do you encourage that second on-ramp is all about the developers. How do you encourage those developers to selfishly experiment with things? Because these folks are your future developers, future contributors. And then how do you encourage those developers? The contributor on-ramp is how do you actually get them to share their work back? Because contribution flow kind of becomes that success of the project itself. And the other way to think about it is there's a set of tasks that you have to do in each of these on-ramps. When you're encouraging people to use the software for the first time, it's how do you make it trivial to install, configure, and actually use the software? Like, what's that bootstrap process the first time somebody steps into your community? Likewise, when you do it from a developer perspective, it's how do you get that developer who wants to do something selfish for themselves? How do you get them to, a known state? One of the most frustrating experiences you can have, certainly at this point in history, is you go hunting on GitHub or you do a Google search for some software tool, and you find the repo, and you've got no clue what the next step is for you to get that as a working piece of software on your system. You don't even know if it necessarily runs on your system. You don't know if it's been tested, things like that. You could, I think everybody in this call has probably lost a few hours of their life sitting on a GitHub repo trying to get it to build in some kind of known fashion on your own machine. And even if you can get it built, not knowing whether or not you've built it correctly. And then how do you make it, that last on-ramp is how do you make it easy to contribute? Because if it's not easy, that last step won't happen.
Those are three definitely different steps. I like that you use the word selfish, because I always avoid using that word. I always say creating value within their organization instead of using the word selfish.
Paul, you use your phrasing and I'll be part of the reason I say selfish is I need to break people's traditional thinking. There is a mythology that is kind of arisen around open source over the last 20, 25 years that somehow, we're all collaborating together and that there's this wonderful altruistic sense of it all. And that, you need to be contributing back kind of thing, that if you used the software, you must contribute back. And I cry foul on all of it. The history of open source, both before we called it open source and since, is one of a core group of people actively sharing outbound. You've published it under an open source license, you're actively sharing it. You have no expectation of anything in return. But you published it, you're willing to share it. There's a group of folks that if you build these on-ramps well, there's a group of folks that will selfishly do things with your software. That's fantastic, that's success. And then the real economics on the back end, and like I said, we'll talk about it in more detail, is they discover that living on their fork is expensive. And if they contribute back to the core project, so that their work ongoing is actually part of the core project. Not only does everybody else get the benefit of it, they don't have to eat the direct cost of managing the fork anymore. And that doesn't mean that you're suddenly supporting their software. What it means is they aren't managing a fork anymore, possibly a very complex fork. And so it really is about engineering economics. So it's you know, so that's why I say selfish, Paul. I need to break people away from that thinking.
I like drilling into that. Christian, you have a comment?
Yeah, actually, I like the fact that first you bring people, on-ramp people by saying it's open source and free, and then they realize it is expensive. Love it.
It's so, free like a puppy.
Exactly. Oh, I love that even more. Actually, people spend tons of money on puppies. But anyway, back to the subject. So if you can you go back one? I think I have to say something, right? Christian Reich, and I work for IQVIA, and I've always been at OHDSI and OMOP for a long time, and very interested in figuring out the functioning of the open source and intrigued by it. So this is all. So it's a little bit looks a little bit, but you may correct me here. Like Apache Foundation, where there is a myriad of projects which are fairly independent from each other, but we don't have that, right? Our projects and our software isn't just one, even though what Martijn and Mark does is probably the most relevant for the ultimate output. But there are lots of them who have to play together. So how do you do that? How do you make them actually integrate with each other and talk to each other instead of just, it being a dialogue between one person and one group? And certainly Linux and CPAN and all these guys, and what's the thing that Perl had, they all solved that problem somehow.
Absolutely. And so the nonprofit thing, I've got a chunk of time dedicated to that on the back end, but the kind of your questions, absolutely a good set of questions. The thing is to recognize that there is a difference between the way a project functions, and it may be a collection of projects that are all kind of related. The same people are kind of collaborating across the projects as well as within a project. So you'll see that model in successful things. And it sounds like OHDSI, there's enough complexity to OHDSI that you have a real collection of projects. And each project is a small project, and together you've got what amounts to a distro of a collection of projects. When you step it up, that next level up into a nonprofit space, so things like the Apache Software Foundation, you're actually tackling a different problem at that point. And we'll talk about it, but what you're really trying to address at that point is a liability problem. When Apache, and I use the original Apache web server project as the example later here, but there is that point where liability becomes a problem for the individual contributors, because in the early days of Apache, none of them had the backing of an organization. So they were carrying that liability on themselves. That said, once you form a nonprofit, now you've got a different set of governance things to think about, that it might be the same people thinking about it, but they have to wear two different hats, one from a nonprofit perspective and one from a project perspective. So it is you're tackling different problems at that point, and we'll talk some more about that later.
Yeah, I don't know if we've hit major liability issues within OHDSI yet, but a good tactical example today is we're moving our core data model from 5.3.1 to 5.4. We've got close to 200 repos. How do we coordinate with them so they can, one, be backwards compatible, which we think they will be, but take advantage of the new features in the new data model? So that requires some level. We like being decentralized. Yep. But we also want, how do we enable and encourage coordination?
Absolutely, and that's something that I'm sorry I didn't add to this. At the break, I'll see if I can quickly add it to it because one of the class modules that I taught this semester was on doing releases, and so I've blithely assumed along the way that Odyssey had a release mechanism kind of thing because of the sheer scope of uh, the existing community, not realizing you didn't necessarily have a release mechanism. So I'll see at the break. I will see if I can quickly cobble some slides into the discussion about how to think about release mechanisms.
Yes, Stephen, our issue isn't that we don't have a release mechanism. Our issue is that we have plenty of release mechanisms.
I understand. Yeah, there's 20 projects, you have 20 release mechanisms. I get it. And that is something where that is a distinct stage in growth that you can tackle right now without a nonprofit. That particular one, um, the uh, the Eclipse Foundation did it as part of what the nonprofit was created to do. But the reality is that piece of engineering process, and really like that's where we were kind of stepping into this idea of construction activities and such. Um, there's that piece of construction activity can actually be done without any kind of a nonprofit. It is a matter of getting the right people together to put together a release plan. And that's, like I said, my apologies. I might have asked questions better before we did this. But I think I can give you a few slides quickly based on something that I did this semester. So there really is this idea, though, that as you're thinking about those three on-ramps, that there's a collection of activities that you're doing, and those activities kind of nicely lay out as there's a set of community development activities, and there's a set of things that you think of as more software construction maturity activities. And you know, when you start looking at them, I have been a product manager and a development manager for large pieces of my career. Uh, Not so much in the last 10 years, but prior to that. And so to me, it is about, you know, doing software at scale means you have this kind of consistent way of building known, repeatable, executable things. So, you know, when you start looking at the software construction activities within a project, the kinds of things you need to be thinking about are, you know, consistent executables are being built and available for known platforms. So it doesn't matter that you support all the platforms, but you clearly articulate we run on, you know, Windows, Mac, and this version of Debian Linux kinds of things. That your project build is an automated thing, that, you know, somebody's not handcrafting executables in a corner somewhere. Um, that, you know, you've got an installer for known platforms. The complete source is published and available and easy to download, so that one of those selfish developers can actually step in and start to learn how this software works. Software source can be navigated to aid understanding, and that's typically more of a documentation and a directory tree structuring kind of thing. Project can be tested to a known state. It doesn't matter whether you want to get fancy and call it, you know, test-driven development or not. The idea that once you've kind of run that automated build, you can then run an automated test environment of some kind. And that, you know, you've got bug tracking and issue tracking that's available, and that these things are documented. You know, there's that set of things that you do as a project matures, especially if you're doing product. You know, this is kind of the way software engineers scale.
So Steve,
Yep.
actually, so if you want to go back a slide, this is actually a great part to pull in Mark Tyne and Mark to talk about all the activities they've done with Hades to do just that. We've done, I think we had the Hades hackathon. We've got a lot of coverage on our testing now, and it might be good to get a state of what is our state of automation with our core Hades package.
The fact that you folks are doing hackathons is fabulous. even just the simple experience that I went through this past semester with a number of open source projects that were providing student projects into the course. The two larger pieces of software that were involved, one run by the City of Paris and another one is run by a Microsoft team. Both of those are large, complex pieces of software, but each of those organizations had participated in a number of hackathons. And in doing so, had been really careful in that on-ramp prep. Now it's prepping for an on-ramp for people in a hackathon setting, but the fact that you've gone through that work means that you understand an on-ramp of a particular kind, that you're going, how short can you make that path to get somebody up and running in your environment? The fun was in two other of the open source projects that we had as participating in this first semesters of code. Each of them felt their project was materially better just in the prep done last July and August, getting ready for the students to approach it and how they were starting to restructure and redocument some of their work to build those on-ramps. So all of this work is, it's the kind of boring chopping wood and carrying water that you have to do in real software, but it has nothing but upside benefits.
Yeah, I thought it might be good for Martijn to give a little bit of our self-assessment where we think we are. I think Hades is probably our most mature because it's at the core. We have over 200 different repos. Hades is our major methods package. We also have other pieces of software that we hope can emulate some of these processes. I don't know, Martijn, where would you say we are?
Yeah, so I was obviously going through this list in my mind and seeing how well we're doing. It's a little bit tricky because we mainly build R packages and they're like you don't build executables of R packages, or you do, but then they're on Krang. But I think otherwise we're doing pretty good on this list. But it's still not easy, I think, for a lot of people to install our software. We definitely need to improve on that track. And I think there are like multiple layers. Like some of our users are programmers, so they know how to install an R package, but then a lot of them are more clinical researchers and they don't necessarily know how R works. And so we actually have this multi-layered approach of like different types of users that we cater to, which I think is a big challenge. But I also agree that the hackathons are having a good experience so far, and we probably will continue. I'm actually making a note right now that we should have one in 2022.
Excellent.
Yeah, one of the pieces that I like so much at Johns Hopkins is so the R method sits on top of a web API that connects to the database, and then there's an Atlas tool which provides data science as a service for clinical researchers who do not need to know how to code. They can ask incredibly complex temporal questions. They can do data characterization and analysis right there without having to be a programmer. So I find this to be an incredibly important tool for our clinical community researchers to be able to work with. And so there's definitely different pieces in that stack that we're trying to mature.
That sounds fabulous. I mean, that is where the whole Jupyter project came from. Yeah. Was that identical idea of giving researchers a better way to manipulate data in a known context, and a better way to display the results as well, and to provide it in these very kind of well documented formats that were actually executable formats. So that sounds fantastic. And it also sounds like it's a separate community hiding within OHDSI. So I mean, with a separate set of kind of goals and requirements.
Yeah. So Atlas is very different because it's all web UI. It's JavaScript. It's really you're right. It's a very different development stack. And as you know, the languages we use for our development stacks defines pieces of the community.
Yeah, and that's normal. I mean, the fact that you're evolving this kind of a complex community there's nothing untoward with that. When you look at some of the other very large. Somebody mentioned Perl and CPAN earlier. Exactly. Like that was a world that, I mean, that world's been around for 30 plus years now, but it started as a way to basically share language components and language tooling. But you look at just the sheer breadth of something like the Kubernetes community at this point, or how the Linux kernel community's evolved over this time, literally thousands of people participating on a kind of a daily basis. Projects can become very large, interesting, communities of people that they don't all look the same when you actually start drilling down into, well, what does that mean that there's thousands of people in the Linux kernel community? Well, they all don't look like Linus, kind of thing. And then, some of your software construction activities in exactly that space, when you start to scale up, you'll start to see really interesting things happening. You'll see complex build pipeline support happening, and sophisticated testing as part of that. One of the things that really surprised me is I brushed up against the OpenStack community going back about 6-7 years ago now. But the way they were showing up on university campuses to do hackathons on a Saturday, and the statement they were making was, oh, within that day, students would be contributing patches into the pipeline. And again, you thought, I'm sorry, that's not possible. Literally, it was like, that can't be possible. But it turns out the way they had set up a very rich environment so that anybody could be testing their patch against a known good environment without it ever crossing the boundary into then being something that the active OpenStack community would be reviewing for considering how to patch it in as a full, kind of full-blown contribution. So that there was literally a way that they had built in this very complex build pipeline and testing pipeline so that anybody could follow the instructions and actually start testing their patches against these big complex environments. So, these kinds of environments can become very complex things. It's not simply, yes, do you have a make file? Yes, do you have some automated, test scripts? But that's neither do you need to go that far. So, it's these are things that I'm trying to just give folks that sense of you can do a lot of software engineering depending on the resources that are participating in your community. And then some of the things are, community development activities. And this really is, your license is that statement of outbound sharing. And that's kind of the first and foremost thing. That you can't escape your license or the need of a license, because unfortunately in 1980, Congress said that computer software was covered by copyright law. So if you're going to share, you need to put a license on it. But beyond that, there's all of the rest of the onboarding documentation. Do you have a basic FAQ or a how-to or that startup tutorial? Are there easy engagement mechanisms for communications? Whether it's, I am not a fan of IRC because I am old and I hate the interruptions. But like there is an entire generation of developers out there, or depending on that community, if you were a system administrator, you grew up on IRC because that's the way everybody quickly communicated problems to one another. When you get into things like a mission statement, if you go and look, Apache's had a mission statement for a very long time. And by that, I mean the Apache web server. Same with the Hadoop community within Apache. Codes of conduct have become normal, and just in how we think about kind of putting that stake in the ground to say we treat each other with respect in this community, and the fact that you've put it in words, kind of thing. So all of these things are kind of community development activities right up through real world events. Yeah, admittedly, this last 20 months has been a challenge for things like that. but we're still figuring our way through the pandemic. But as tired as many of us are of these kinds of yet another virtual event in our lives, it's still a way to bring new folks into your community and develop that community. You should always be recruiting the next generation.
I think this is actually really an important slide. If you want to go back just one step, I find this is where we have a lot of diversity, and I don't see common ways that we're, communicating. We've used GitHub for some project management. I think that's worked out really well for our data model. But Mark or Martin, I don't know if you want to comment on some of these. These I don't think we're doing quite as well as we could be doing for how we engage. We now have a monthly meeting call and Teams for our Hades work group. I don't know, Martin, do you want to describe other things that we're doing with the Hades package?
Sure. So, again, I was going down the list. So a project license, we early on decided was Apache. We do have lots and lots of user documentation, and I'm busy writing documentation more geared towards the developers. The engagement mechanisms, I would say, are okay, but I'm probably missing something in that people either use the forums or the issue trackers for most of the communication. But happy to hear thoughts on how to improve it.
So that was something a colleague and I we've regularly debated this. We started together in the OpenStack community 7 years ago, and they were running they were the person who'd created, and they were running one of the OpenStack projects. And so they had a very different perspective from mine, because I was kind of parachuted over the top into the nonprofit aspects of it, and the nonprofit was broken. But the thing that they noted that OpenStack as a broad community was really good at doing was doing that onboarding work, and the way they done it kind of in two broad strokes. One was they did have a consistent set of tools. So if you were a developer working on one OpenStack project, then you could get involved in another one that might be more directly related to you. It's not that you were stepping out of yours into another, but you wanted to go and work with another project because there was some fit between the two. Because they'd worked diligently to build out kind of those common tools underneath, so that everybody was using, kind of the same issue tracker, and that we're using it in the same way. Everybody was doing release planning in the same way, that you had a way to actually quickly step from one project to another, so that there was kind of consistent tooling that way. And that made it really easy to actually allow people to move around within, and for work to happen across projects. The other thing that they did was they always, for every one of their physical conferences, they had a day zero onboarding process, where if you were new to the OpenStack developer community, the way you typically you would find yourself going to the next OpenStack summit, and there was 2 a year. And day zero was them the developers wrapping their arms lovingly around you to bring you in and tell you, this is how we do things here. And to just give you that sense of community immediately, that there were processes. What questions do you have? Let me show you how these basic things work. Now, that was very much tied to real world events, but it's the same transference of culture, and I talk about this some more later. That same transfer of culture that the IETF has been doing for 36 years now. ITF, you show up at the IETF for the first time, day zero is all about, let us show you how we succeed. Let us show you how you can become part of this. And just taking people through the basics. And it's everything from, how to do basic builds and for IETF, it's how the process actually works and making sure everybody understands the terminology in front of them. So it's all of that kind of onboarding activity. They actually turn into a physical, in real life kind of event for folks whenever they have events. So these kinds of things are incredibly important onboarding things. And that is, so it's the interesting thing about that, for all that people like me think we know about this space, one of the big surprises, I work for Sarah Novotny. Sarah runs the open source ecosystem team in the Azure office of the CTO. Sarah was the engineering manager that built the Kubernetes architecture of participation. When Kubernetes was, half a dozen developers at Google, Google hired her as the program manager that then put in place the growth mechanisms and allowed it to scale to what it is in a dramatically short period of time. The thing that we've discovered, though, is so that core group of developers, of the original 6, there's 1 left. All the rest of them have left Google. Sarah left. She works for Microsoft now. The next wave of people, they're kind of on Gen 3 of this community that grew under these incredible, kind of driven growth circumstances. They're on Gen 3 now, and they didn't take the time from Gen 1 to Gen 2 and then Gen 2 to Gen 3 to teach the culture. And the Kubernetes community is in real trouble right now. And that's because those onboarding things become really, really important at teaching people this is how we behave as a community. And so that's something that I think, it sounds like you have a really strong community right now, and it might not be something that has a lot of written structure and a lot of written culture, but it sounds like the culture you've evolved is very healthy. So you want to start thinking about, how do we teach this culture? And kind of continuing along that line is there is this idea that when I was talking about, a set of activities kind of lined up along 2 axes, they actually do become your 3 on-ramps. You can kind of, a way to think about ordering them to make sure you're there is you need to be encouraging users, because that's where you're going to find your developers, and then encouraging the developers because that's where you're going to find your future contributors. So that's the idea of kind of interlocking these 3 on-ramps again. And to a certain extent, I laugh, what does your 10-minute rule look like? Back in the early 90s, I was in the packaged software world on PCs. The product teams, it was beaten into us that we had a 10-minute rule. From the time you pulled the shrink wrap off the box and loaded it onto the PC to get to the software doing something trivial and useful, you had about 10 minutes. Because after that, if it was going to take longer than 10 minutes to get to that first kind of the dog sat up and barked moment where that user felt that there was a success, that they'd think, oh, this is going to take longer than I thought it was, and they'd put it up on the shelf, and it became shelfware and was never used again. And now that fall off is kind of this well understood number back in the package days. The number is actually shorter than 10 minutes, but typically you can get 10 minutes of somebody trying something. And that's just to the first point. It just might be that, okay, that was the first 10 minutes, and now that they've seen some success, you can get them to the next 10 minutes and the next 10 minutes. So when you're thinking about these on-ramps, that's what your user on-ramp looks like. Can you get them to an installed point where they think they've installed the thing in that kind of 10-minute kind of space? And yeah, if you were thinking about a tutorial or a hackathon, you might have a more involved, okay, here's the 4 pieces of software you need to install in this order on a Windows machine or a Mac or a Linux base. But at this point in history, depending on the way you're working with things, what two of those organizations with large complex software, what they do for their hackathons is one has a Docker container, the other one just has a virtual machine image that they just hand to people and say, here is all the software in a known configured state for you. So there's always ways to tackle this problem to get people to that known state fairly quickly.
Yeah, we have certainly an Odyssey in a box and a tutorial system. So Mark,
Fantastic.
did you want to make a comment?
I was just going to make a comment to the larger group, thanking Stephen for reminding us about the 10-minute rule. I feel this is one place where we as a community are failing. And one example of that is there's a discussion thread going on and difficulties installing the R-based Odyssey tool stack. And we as a community should think about maybe a mini environment that individuals can install relatively quickly and see some results before that point of frustration. Dockers and containers, I'm a big proponent of that, and that's one way to do that. We have security issues amongst some of our data partners when it comes to containerization. So in addition to that, we need to be thinking about maybe a mini R Odyssey install where people can get that hello world feedback and that nice endorphin run early enough so that they continue through.
You're reading ahead, aren't you? Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, sorry, I wasn't. But now I just did. Sorry, Stephen.
Well, and that from that developer perspective, I mean, depending on the nature of the tool in front of you, it's a 10-minute rule. If you're a user and you're installing something, it's what's your hello world look like? Again, keeping an eye on the time. A developer will always give you a little more time, but they still want to have some confidence that they're in a known state. Sarah jokingly used to say, what's your mean time to dopamine kind of thing. That it is that when's that endorphin rush come on? It's like, oh, I did a thing. And that it was the right thing kind of thing. Like there's no question that you've done the right thing. That's the feeling the 10-minute rule has. And again, we're talking about things here that mature projects do. That doesn't mean that, oh, you're failing because you haven't done them. It means that, there's a consistency here, though, that if you clearly in your community you've got certain pain points that, it would be good to fix some of those, because if you make it easier for those users, you'll find some more developers that you'll hopefully onboard as contributors. And that's just why you're thinking about some of these things. There's not a right or a wrong here. But that is basically why I kind of try and frame it as 3 on-ramps. This is the connectivity between them. These are the kinds of buckets of activities. And the other thing, when you're looking across it as community development activities versus software construction activities, by somewhat separating those ideas in your head, you're also opening up the idea of people that might not be software engineers and can't help with the one set of activities can absolutely help with the other set of activities. They can be genuine contributors in the broad community. They can be maintainers, not necessarily committers of code, but maintainers with responsibility for certain pieces of the project that's part of the larger Odyssey community. So it's about working in that space. I didn't realize I was setting myself up for, I mean, just in terms of kind of roles, when I talk about roles in this space, a committer is somebody that has full right privileges on the project directory tree. Typically you were the creator, the originating authors. Over time, you've invited other people to be committers with that responsibility on the code tree. I tend to distinguish that from maintainers. Lots of folks will conflate those two ideas depending on the project, but I separate them enough that maintainers are people that have responsibility within that project community for some aspect of the project. They aren't necessarily a committer in the tree, but they're still recognized as a maintainer in the community, as a leader within the community. User is any person that is basically using the software for its intended purpose. And intended purpose is kind of the key there. That's that differentiation, because the developer, that's the person that they were using it for its intended purpose, and now they want to change it. So they aren't merely offering you an idea, here's a suggestion of something that would be great if somebody else went and built it. The developer is the person who now is going to go build it. And then turning that, selfish developer into a contributor is kind of that's what one of those on-ramps is all about. And again, just emphasizing that idea of, contributions can mean many, many things. And I really want to emphasize that, because yes, at the heart of it, there's always the code. And as somebody who developed software for a living, yes, without useful running code, the rest of this is somewhat moot. But there is so many ways to involve so many people. And even on developers who might one day contribute code, those developers still have a wealth of other things they could be contributing to you right now. So it's not about, are you a developer, did you write code? It really is, are you a person in this community, that wants to contribute back to it? And have you made it easy for them to contribute back? And we've already, to a certain extent, talked about this. The fact that you're doing hackathons is fabulous, because that is just from what I've seen in the past, certainly emphasized by this past year in prep and then execution around semesters of code. Any of these activities, gearing up for a hackathon or participating in something like semesters of code, forces the current community to improve those project on-ramps, even if you didn't think of them as on-ramps. It's just a great way to drive a lot of that. So that was kind of the end of the first module. How are we doing? People have additional questions and comments, or do you want me to? We can soldier right along here.
Look, we're having a great conversation online, and we're definitely, it's really feeding into this one. So I really like your feedback too, to some of our direct questions. So no, I think this is right on point.
Perfect. Okay, so the next,
Well, I was trying to look back at some things I was thinking of for summarizing. I do feel we don't have consistency on communication for how to be involved with different projects. There's definitely a lot of things that we could do on the consistency front for different. Hades is our main core package, but there's a lot of other packages that it'd be great to be able to emulate and do this same processes with.
Yep, and it is something that you'll notice by the end of today that I will not have said you must do it this way for anything. And the reason for that, lots of folks, when they step into this space, that so much earlier than where the Odyssey community is right now, they come in and they want the recipe, book. Like, tell us the 5 things that I need to do next. And the hard part is, and it took a long time for a collection of us that are kind of core to these discussions right now broadly in the open source community. There isn't a recipe book, because every community kind of has to find its way to what works in that community. It's like saying, what's the one way we're going to set up a town? Well, there's a common set of things that successful towns all have. But the order they happened in and the way that town grew into a proper town functioning community of people living in that town is different every time. And it's different for all manner of reasons, from the geography to the participants to the size. And so, you even have to be sensitive, as you've already discovered in just the variation across your community, that you can't necessarily mandate things, Because at the end of the day, all of your success is predicated on the idea that there's a person that would like to do some work to contribute to the community, and you need to find a way to say yes to them. And sometimes that means that the tools don't line up. And if you do want to align those tools, that means there's going to be additional work, and somebody has to sign up for it. You know, mandating things from on high doesn't really work when you're dealing with these kind of rich community experiences. So that's why I'm afraid I can't give you exact rules. I can only tell you the patterns that kind of lead to good places.
The patterns and the anti-patterns. That's always very helpful.
Well, and that's what this section's about. This is one of the most important things you can learn. Freeloaders means you're doing it right. One of the biggest frustrations I have, and the way you often see it articulated, is either a community leader of a runaway success that never built a community. So they're basically a lone developer. And now they're drowning in people's helpful suggestions and bug reports. Or you'll see this in a startup environment where a company has mistakenly believed that an open source community is an on-ramp for customers. And they run into this idea that, well, they've got all this stuff for free. They have to give something back. And I get pretty hardcore on this. It's a hard line in the sand for me. You published it under an open source approved license. You have no expectation of a return. The fact that you've got this much, kind of success means this is a good thing. Freeloaders is a good thing.
Steve, what's a freeloader?
A freeloader is somebody who is using your software and giving you nothing in return.
Good, thanks. I like it.
Yep, and that's the thing. That the way I try and walk folks into this discussion is to actually walk them through the very real experience of, we all choose the community that we live in, the neighborhoods we live in, for really personal reasons. It could be our commute, our partner's commute, where the kids are going to school, places of worship, family, hobbies. We choose our neighborhoods for really personal reasons. And, you basically have three sorts of neighbors in your community. And I often do this for sheer grins and giggles with a room. The first time I did it was with 200 people that were kind of self-identified as open source community managers. But there's this idea that there's really three types of neighbors in your community. There are the people that simply want to live there. And those are your, it's then there's the people that know how to report, potholes or trash, street lamps that are out, those sorts of people. And then there's the people that organize the block party. There's always a block party. Every culture has a block party. I have had the privilege of living in 3 different countries in my life. And, it doesn't matter whether, it's the Queen's Jubilee or, Labor Day in Canada for the last Labor Day barbecue of the summer, or, the 4th of July in America. All of these communities, there's always a reason for a block party. And it's the same thing in your project community. There are people that simply want to use the software. You've published it under an open source license. You've said this is, we are broadly sharing this software. And those people just want to use it. They just want to live in your community. And then there's the people that are happily going to report bugs. They're going to offer ideas for features and things like that. And then, there's that group of people that will actually contribute code, documentation, use cases, and all the other things. And the tough part of this is it is rules, it is orders of magnitude. For every 1,000 users, 100 people will file a bug. of which 10 will give you a patch, of which, you know, 1 actually read your contribution guidelines. And the first time I came across that joke was 20 years ago. Somebody that was running the community for video drivers on Linux. And if you go back 20 years ago, you might imagine how small a community that was. And they said, you know, the 9 people on the planet that really understood video device drivers and Linux were all in the community already. And then they kind of did this hand wave of, you know, for every 1,000 users, 100 people file a bug, 10 people give us a patch, and 1 actually read our contribution guidelines. And I happened to be sitting beside somebody who created and ran the SendMail community. And I asked them, like, do those numbers feel right to you? And they kind of walked through in their head, and yeah, those were kind of right. And I've been anecdotally testing this, and I've been talking to people for 20 years now, and this is the kind of feel. It's I have no direct science. I apologize to the statisticians in this call. But the general rule of thumb is it's an orders of magnitude kind of problem. And you know, it was a joy testing this. The first time I boldly tested this in front of 200 community managers, you know, people that clearly were in the room because they ran open source community. And I said, okay, you know, show of hands. How many of you know how to report a street lamp out in your neighborhood? And, you know, 200 people, about 20 of them put up their hand. I said, great. Okay, everybody put your hands down. Now, out of this room full of community managers, how many of you organize the block party? And it wasn't 1%, it was 2%. So in a room full of people who are, you know, open source community managers by trade, that they know how to do this, only 2% of them really were the folks that were willing to do the block party kind of thing. This I think is a function of human community. So there isn't, you know, I talked about Onramps, and I'll give you the secret to the Onramp thing in a minute. But it's this is the way people behave in community. You know, most of us just want to live in the neighborhood. And we chose the neighborhood for really personal reasons. Most people just want to be users of your software. And that doesn't mean that they won't contribute to the block party, but they need to know how. They need to be encouraged. They need to be led into the block party kind of thing. You know, the block party in the current community I happen to live in right now, there are a couple of organizers that, yep, it's always the same 2 families that organize the block party in a community of about 80 households. But oddly enough, they make sure that they always ask for help. They predefine a set of things to make sure that people can contribute. And oddly enough, their job gets smaller because a lot of people pitch in. So it's about building those on-ramps for folks so that they know how to contribute. Because even though we just want to live in the community, we also, you know, we're happy to help out when we can, and we know when we've been shown how to help out. From that freeloader perspective, though, another way of saying this is that for every 900 freeloaders, you'll get about 100 bug reports, of which, you know, 10 people will give you a patch, of which 1 actually read your guidelines. And the real kicker here is it goes back to that idea. These users still identify as members of your tribe. They still think they're living in your neighborhood. So, you know, trying to tell them they need to give you something for using the software that you published for free is not a helpful message. And so that's, you know, it's one of those things where it drives me nuts when you see people that have successfully published useful software under an OSI approved license, and they've had an enormous uptake of users, and then they complain. It's like, well, what did you think was going to happen? And when I said, you know, here is the secret, though. I was party to something the first time I worked for Microsoft. This is about 2002 timeframe. There was a project called Rotor, more formally called the Shared Source CLI. We basically took a cut through what was the brand new .NET back in 2001, 2002 timeframe. And we published it. It was about 500,000 lines of code. Because we were working with product, we basically cut down the product to something that was a useful 500,000 lines, and we cut down the test environment to something that was a useful 500,000 lines. We created a platform adaptation layer, so it ran on Windows as well as Mac as well as FreeBSD, because we didn't say Linux in those days. Literally, that was the reason it ran on FreeBSD and not Linux. We had a single script to set up the environment on those 3 machines. We had a single command that basically invoked a makefile-like environment to build everything. We had a single command to test it all. We had minimal documentation when we published this. So 1,000,000 lines of code out the door, a few scripts to build things, and our entire documentation was a few screen fills that probably filled 2 to 3 pages if you printed it, that said, this is how to unpack the tar archive, this is how to set up your environment by typing this command, this is how to build it, this is how to test it, and you should see these 3 failed test cases, because that's how we hadn't figured out how to fix the last 3 failures. And so, 24 hours later, we received the last piece of documentation was, this is how the directory structure kind of lays out. So, the base class libraries over here, C# compilers over there, the runtime engines over here, kind of thing. 24 hours later, we received our first patch. And it was a 15-line patch from somebody who deeply understood the Intel chipset and deeply understood just-in-time compilers, and it gave us a 10% boost in performance. So even though, for every 1,000 users, you'll get 100 bug reports, of which 10 people will give you patches and 1 really read your guidelines, that doesn't mean that you can't get that golden patch in the first 24 hours. So don't be confused that you need to somehow wait for those 1,000 users before you start seeing stuff. The on-ramps actually are useful at getting those golden patches immediately. And the thing was, 24 hours later, we received the second righteous patch. Somebody had actually figured out how to fix one of the 3 broken test cases that we could not ourselves fix. They'd figured it out, and they'd actually figured out the more complex bug fix, and demonstrated that they could, not only that the test case now passed, but they'd added a couple of test cases to show that their broader fix also worked in other situations. So I mean, you can start to get these things remarkably quickly. The sad part of that story is, this was not a true open source project. It was published under an academic research license. And because it was still tied to product code, and this is the Microsoft of 20 years ago, we were so shriekingly paranoid about contributions coming in that, despite the fact that we'd received these 2 golden contributions in the first 2 days of publishing this source base, we politely refused them. We said, thank you, that's a fantastic patch, but we're not accepting patches at this time. And after you say that a couple of times to your community, they will stop giving you things. It was still an enormously useful project from a teaching and research perspective. It got a number of new languages up on the common language runtime and things. But as an open source project, it was a complete failure. And it was never supposed to be an open source project. But that was a tough thing. And, it's but you can get those absolute golden patches that quickly. One of the things that I just went through was the reverse of trying to teach the students how to think about this as a software engineering problem. That, you know, that when you write an interesting program for yourself, well, it really only has to work for you on your machine. You know, there's zero engineering involved. You might have a lot of computer science involved. You might be doing some pretty amazing things from an algorithmic perspective, and there might be a lot of programming prowess being demonstrated in how you chose to solve that problem, but there's no engineering involved. Now, if you share it with 10 friends, well, you know, those 10 friends will probably start to give you feedback of some kind. And so you might want to add a little bit of process. If you share that program, that application with 100 users, okay, they're probably not friends anymore. And now you have to start to add process and structure for how you think about, you know, capturing that feedback. Whether it's somebody just complaining that something's broken, okay, you need a bug reporting system, or whether they're suggesting new features, or whether, you know, they're asking for the source code so they can give you a contribution, or already giving you a, you know, I wrote a blog post about it, where do you want it, kind of thing. By the time you get up to, you know, 1,000 users, or if it's, you know, wildly successful, 10,000, 100,000, or you build a product and you have 1 million users out there, you need a lot more engineering. And engineering, it really is, it's about, you know, kind of software at scale. And it is that idea of scaling in the community for the number of users, and, you know, making sure that everybody understands the expectations and practices for their role, whether they're a user or a selfish developer. You know, they just want to build to a known state. Scaling in the participants, whether that's developers or maintainers or contributors, again, making sure everybody understands their expectations. What are the practices and processes and tooling in place? And then scaling for the software, because now, as you you already have this rich environment in Odyssey today, where, you know, you've got a broad community with lots of different pieces in it. And that kind of scale also requires a certain engineering practice for how you grow it. Again, one of the things I was trying to teach.
Hey, Steve, would you mind going back a slide? I do think this
Sure.
is a great slide to have a discussion around. I like this one too. Scale in the community use. I'm trying to think, what does that mean to us? We have people download our software, they install it, and we might not know about them using it. But then we can actually do network studies where we can exchange our phenotypes across different institutions. And we know that we've got close to 800 million patients uniquely mapped into the OHDSI format. So we have around 10% of the world's population. We have over 350 databases that have been somewhat registered into the OHDSI community. So we have scale in the community of use. I don't know if that's users in terms, we think of an institution or an organization as a use. The scale of participants is interesting too. I don't know how it's interesting how we set expectations and practices of the user. We do have a lot of working groups to get the users to learn how to do phenotyping, how to do cohort definitions. And so we do have a lot of training, and we do create a lot of YouTube videos on training users on how to use it. We've launched a new learning management system over the last year for actually directly training and developing their new skills and using the tool. I don't know, and we do have a developer's guideline. So I'm thinking the scale for participants is something that, certainly something that I'd like to think more about. I don't know, Mark or Martijn, if you got thoughts on scale of participants or on the automation side.
One thing we're lacking is discussion on how to document users or the user base. The software is there, it can be downloaded, it can be used, but we haven't had a discussion over how do we want to trace its use, what types of requirements might we want to put on the end user to document the use of our tools. For larger organizations, this is easier to do because most studies are built upon skeletons that we deliver, and you can find those skeletons. But I suspect there's plenty of use of the tools that goes undocumented. So Stephen, I thank you for bringing up kind of the scale of use of the communities. We don't actually have an understanding of what the expectations are on users in using our tools.
Well, I think one of the things though that we talked about earlier and is coming up again in this context, the thing that's really interesting in the OHDSI community that makes it different from most of the more I say commercial, but I want to get away from that, but commercial for lack of a better word.
Single product.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing that I will try and hammer home for people in the same way that freeloaders means you're doing it right. Don't confuse your projects and your products. But that idea that because of the richness of your community of use, that you almost have two tiers of users that you might need to think about. It sounds like that ability to capture the use in not just the simple set of users using the software, but that broader use that I'm sorry, I'm forgetting who suggested it. Like that idea that you want to come up with that library, that way of curating, a consistent way of referring to the results so that others can find them. That's a second order of community use that really sounds like it requires secondary thinking. And so, second order thinking, because this goes back, I think this is why, involving folks, certainly people like Saeed living in the library, and he, not only is he, a librarian, which I love calling him a librarian. He's not on yet, is he? I'm hoping not, because he's actually a PhD engineer who ended up in the library.
So we'll call him a library scientist. How's that?
Yeah. It's just the joy of, he's a librarian. But I think it's that second order user effect that it becomes a curation of the output of your project that it needs thinking in a different way and captured in management and treated as a separate community of use rather, and that might be the way to think about it. Because I just think you've got a new and interesting curation problem, because the success of your open source project community is generating another thing entirely, which has a different community of use, if I'm understanding things correctly.
No, I think you are. Those are some great suggestions. Martijn, you have your hand up.
That's right. Yeah, on a slightly different topic, I think I'm struggling with another circle in your Venn diagram that's currently not there. So of the one person. Yep. Sorry.
I said always possible.
So of the one person who contributed something and actually read your guidelines, I think I'm looking for the 0.1 person who wants to be a maintainer.
Different on-ramp.
Okay, got it. Yeah, because I think so currently
Mark,
for me that's a bit of,
to this.
sorry, go ahead.
I think it's important. The reason I walk folks visually through this in a couple of different ways, one of them was back in this kind of way of thinking about the on-ramps, collecting together activities to drive each of the on-ramps and how you could look at them as a build from encouraging users to encouraging developers to encouraging contributors, but then trying to set that framework but understand you're wrestling with that orders of magnitude problem. And then still trying to provide hope. You really can get that gold on the first day. But it's that what you're referring to is that acknowledgement that building community is an active thing, and it doesn't happen. You have to do it. And that's the thing that I think when open source was less prevalent, 25 years ago, there was that understanding that you actually had to, yes, working on the software, that was a lot of hard work. Building the community was a second set of activities that was equally difficult, like equally work to be done. That it doesn't just happen. And that's part of that kind of culture and governance that needs to be understood and honored and carried out, or you get stuck with, yep, you can wait for the random contributions to show up, or you can actively build the on-ramps and then actively encourage them. And then that you are correct. That next step is to actively encourage not just the contribution, but the next step of encouraging them to be a maintainer. Once you've got contributors that are making regular contributions and you can see the value of the work that's being contributed, they clearly care about the community because they've been making multiple contributions. That now you have somebody that you want to figure out, okay, now how do we encourage them to take that next step? How do we make them a maintainer? So you are absolutely seeing the right things here.
Thank you. So you're coming back later to things like funding and like how those people are going to get paid?
Yeah, we will get there. Maybe it might not be the way you think, but we will get there. And then the last thing in this section that I wanted to talk about was just I'm sure you're seeing this in various guises, and you may have already been through it just because of the kind of the breadth of the OHDSI community so far. But the great thing about open source projects that are large and successful over products that are large and successful is that projects typically handle the technology debt problem. They get to the point where the cost of the patch and the next one and the next one on top of it kind of thing, and you end up in this maintenance debt hell that most successful open source projects take that step back and refactor at some point and and refactoring is nothing more than managing your technical debt, right? And you end up restructuring the software to enable things to no longer be caught in this patch management problem. Every major OSI project that I know of hits a refactoring point, sometimes multiple refactoring points over the years. It was Apache certainly refactored a number of times early in its life that enabled the growth of contribution flow. The Linux kernel refactored multiple different times. They refactored, I think it was the 2.1 to 2.2 kernel 20 odd years ago now. That was they were finally in a state where they had to rewrite the scheduler and rewrite the virtual memory manager because they were now being used in bigger and bigger pieces of hardware and they just couldn't accept those changes. And then at a different period in time, they came up with a whole new pluggable device driver refactoring. So everything hits the refactoring point. And so if you haven't already in some of your projects, just know that it's coming. Know that you'll hit a point where you decide, the next release, we're actually going to work on refactoring this so that we can continue to grow. That kind of brings us to the next section where I want to talk about culture and governance. But how are folks feeling? Do they want 15 minutes?
Time for a break, to take a little 15-minute break and then come back to talk about culture and governance. Yeah, this is a great conversation. I think the technology debt one is really one that I think that we are beginning to hit. With having so many repos, of so many different pieces in our ecosystem, trying to keep them coordinated or trying to make sure that they're all, they're all compatible. I do feel like this is something that we're definitely looking into. The web, we have a web API on our main system, which is really very useful for making things loosely coupled, which I find helps us minimize some of the technology debt. But a lot of it is also, a lot of our software is just tied directly into the database, into a database model, which can be a little bit less flexible.
Right. And I was going to make a quick suggestion. So I'm going to, run and grab a coffee kind of thing. Do you want to stop the recording right now so you can start it fresh when we pick it up at the top of the hour, and that way you can do a part 2?
That sounds like a great idea. That sounds like we'll do that.
Okay, and so I will see everybody back at the top of the hour, and I will even try and squeeze in a few slides on releases.
Thanks, Steve. I'll see you in 10 minutes.
And talk to you in a few minutes.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.